this is the big picture. So there are many things we could discuss, and we have a fair amount of time, so I hope we'll get to a bunch of questions and comments from the audience. But, and I'm going to ask in a minute Niklas to just start off, because he's such a big picture thinker. I've actually done this same panel with you before up here, as I recall, and Paul. And we won't make it quite the same as the last time I was up here with Paul, when he so famously called into question Google's business model with David Drummond sitting right next to him. That was quite a memorable moment. Anyway, if you look at the big picture we're in right now, from a global point of view, as Niklas pointed out, and I'm stealing this point from him, although I agree with it very powerfully and deeply, is that, the internet is transforming everything, every aspect of business and society, and most of business and society isn't really ready for that. So that's the really big picture we're in right now as technologists and as the kind of people that attend DLD. And then on the other side, I think there's two or three other big picture issues that have to be put into this discussion. And one is that the growth in markets generally are in the developing world and in places that have historically not been good markets. And that's a hugely exciting prospect. But oddly, at the same time, the developed world is right now in a period of tremendous pessimism. Economically, politically, and that, I think, is something probably most people in this room do not share, but it is a fundamental reality of the big picture we're living in, that certainly in the United States and Europe in general, people think, we're screwed. But if you understand tech and you believe in the potential of tech, it's a lot easier to be optimistic. And I think everyone up here would share that point of view. So that's my quick big picture intro, but I want to now turn it over to Niklas to just give us his point of view on what are the big picture things that you're thinking about as a multiple, serial, incredibly successful entrepreneur, and now a venture capitalist.
So, it's interesting, because I think that I share what you're saying, but it's probably never been as exciting to be in this technology industry as it is now. I'm just thinking back, when I started work after university in the early 90s, we had dial-up modems and it was fantastic. We were fiddling around with Unix computers, and remember the first web browser was fantastic, and it was like awesome that you could actually connect to other people, but it was really, really early days. And then the .com boom come. If you didn't start a company then, I thought like I missed out on a life opportunity, because this was one thing that came and went. But since then, although the world economy goes up and down all the time, the growth of internet usage is continues to grow in a pretty steady speed. So that means that there's just more and more of the world economy is moving to the internet, and the internet has more and more of an impact. But what's been interesting is the last 3 years, I would think, is some pretty big changes, and that primarily I think is the mobile internet that we thought that we would get when we got 3G networks back in 2000, but it didn't happen until the iPhone really kind of disrupted that whole market, and gave us the internet in our pockets, which made us interact with the internet a whole different way, because before we actually had to go to our computer, boot it up. Even back then we had to kind of put on a modem, but then we got problems. We didn't have that. We were always on. But today, whenever we're waiting for a friend, we're waiting for a bus, we're on the bus, we're in the train, we're in a boring meeting, we are on the internet. So that means that more and more of our lives as consumers are moving to the internet, and with that comes also economic value. So I think that's very, very important. But it's also something that is kind of sometimes it goes in contradiction with the rest of the world economy, which is right now in not so good shape. But it doesn't mean that you have less entrepreneurs starting less companies, and online companies can create more and more value. So that's one thing. The other thing is also, if you look at where really the growth is going to be the next several years, it's not going to be in the US, it's not going to be in Europe, it's going to be in emerging markets. So that's what's really, really interesting to study, what's happening in places like all the BRIC countries, but also, you go even further and see growth opportunities in those kind of markets. And some other things that, is interesting, is to look, I remember back, 10 years ago when you started a company, the first thing you did was to go out and buy, a Linux server, and you need to find someone who can help you to, optimize the kernel, and you need to get, connected to a data center. Today, you don't need to do those things. Today, as a company, you can focus on product innovation, because all the back end is now outsourced to companies like Amazon and some others providing great web services. So we're much more today in a product-centric environment. So it's less about pure technology innovation. It's about making product that makes life easier for people. So I think those are some interesting points. And one impact of this is also that great companies can today come from everywhere. It's no longer the fact that all great companies are coming from Silicon Valley, although Silicon Valley is the one place that creates most great companies. But for every day, the likelihood that the next big company is coming from outside of Silicon Valley is getting bigger and bigger. So I think there may be some of the highlights.
That's good. Thank you. Did you want to just jump in, Paul? Because I'm totally open-minded about what happens next. Go ahead.
Maybe I comment on the technology and globalization point. I think that's absolutely right if technology is driving the subject, if it is a technological product. If product is content, if product is e-commerce, then it's a total different ballgame. That is very local, regional, national. So rolling out these kind of business models in 20 countries at the same time is burning so much money that most people who did in the past didn't survive.
So the question might be then, what are the chances that indigenous and entrepreneurs are going to emerge in all of these geographies to basically do it themselves? I mean, and I think we're seeing that surprisingly well. I mean, I've been talking, I think there's 5 or 6 Argentinian entrepreneurs and VCs here, and there's a very vital economy of the internet in Argentina, for example. And I think we could name 10 or 15 countries where that's true that it didn't used to be true. But Greg, it is an honor to have an open-minded Amazon person being willing to be on stage, so thank you. And you do have a big picture view about where the industry that Amazon is so important in is going. So talk a little bit about how you look at that. And thank you again for being here.
Yes, well, certainly from what we heard, that it's easier and easier to start up companies now and take that technology piece and think of that as a pay-for-service so that you can focus on the product that you're actually delivering, being a web site, being an e-commerce experience, or any other number of ways of using rich data. And web services was basically built just for that premise, to allow small startups as well as large enterprises to start leveraging our massive infrastructure that we've made just for that. And so, just to put a point to that, Amazon.com and all of the European websites and the Asian websites all use web services. They're customers of that. And each and every day, we're adding enough capacity in web services that would have powered the Amazon 5 years in. So basically the equivalent of a $3 billion revenue company. We're adding that much capacity each day to our web services, which is just phenomenal every time I hear that. And that's because there's very much a need, and people recognize that thinking of the technology infrastructure and having that as a pay-as-you-go service allows companies to focus on the differentiation and allow their, focus on their customers. For Amazon, the big picture is all about 3 things that I would sum up. One is starting with the customers and working backwards. We're very, very customer focused. But you can't just be customer focused. For us, we feel we need to have a long-term perspective, which means not 2 to 3 years, but 7 to 10 years. And continue to look on anything you're building and finding ways to extend the platform to enable customers in unique ways. And so one of the most recent examples, I'm trying to head off a question I'm sure that's going to come. One of the more recent examples is the Kindle Fire. This was really a culmination of about 15 years of our work. This small device is a window into the internet, provides a great shopping experience that you would expect with Amazon. But you can also buy over 19 million different media products, applications, books, music, videos, have it streaming, has its own browser. It runs on AWS. The browser splits itself between the device, optimizes between the device and the Amazon Web Services. So this is an example of Amazon thinking very big picture, thinking long term, and certainly when you talk about the tools that were available in 1994, 1995, when the internet first came out, if anyone takes a look at the very first website we had and said the culmination 15 years later would be the handheld device that allows you to do all these phenomenal things, nobody would have believed you. So I think you need to take a long-term view, and certainly that's what Amazon has done.
Thanks. And I want to follow up on a number of those points later. But Arkady, you know, talk about a company that is not where anyone would necessarily have, at least Americans would not think that one of the very few real contenders for search on a global basis could be a Russian company. So explain to us what that means for you, what your ambitions are, and how you see the landscape shifting, and how Yandex is going to play a part in that.
This is true that on emerging markets, the landscape on the internet is different from US or Europe. Even generic services like search, mail, social networks, they are in China, in Korea, in Japan, in Russia. They all, the major players there, they're all local. And this is one thing which everybody noticed several years ago, and what we see now, at least for us, we hope that the new trend for us would be to go from our domestic markets with our technologies to somewhere else. And it's a big opportunity for us. So we own search. Search is the most technology-intensive application online. We probably have technology which is competitive enough to offer it to other markets. And we're thinking in this direction. Where else our Russian-born technology could be applied? What markets? And I think, I hope it will be one of the next trends.
Well, you're already in Turkey. You've got a recently announced, and you're growing quickly in Turkey, a product there, right?
Yeah, we have launched in Turkey several months ago, in October, September, October. We grow very fast. We brought a choice, freedom of choice to Turkish audience. They used to use only US-based services like Facebook, Twitter, Google. Now they at least have some choice in search. They could choose which search engine to use, Google or us. We started to grow very quickly. As any startup, I would say that we grow in a very healthy curve, and we'll see where it goes.
What is your market share in Russia now for Yandex in search?
It's 60%, and that's why actually we went to Turkey, because there's just few markets in the world where there is any competition in search. In US, it's competition between Google and Bing. In China, it's between Baidu and Google. It used to be, at least. There is competition in Korea, in Russia. In Russia, it's us and Google. And there is no competition in Europe, for example, or Latin America. On any market where there is any competition, there is a rule of thumb when the first player gets something like 60% market share, and the second player gets something like 30% market share, and 10% divided between the rest of the players. We noticed this rule of thumb. We don't know why it is, but this is applicable to any competitive market, and we looked in the map and noticed that there is the rest of the world, including Europe, which is not competitive at all. You don't have a choice of a search engine. You have only one decent product, which is Google, and nothing else. So if this rule works elsewhere, we could come to a good product, serious product, to some other markets and try to reach this second level of 30%. And if we came to several markets like that, it's a good business model for us. We don't need to be necessarily a leader immediately to get a serious business model, because it's fine to be a leader on a small market like Russia is today, just $1 billion or so, but there is the rest of the world with the rest of the billions of dollars available.
So Paul, how would you feel if Yandex was operating in Germany? To tie into our earlier panel 2 years ago.
If you want to get my consumer perspective, I always like choice.
Yeah.
If you would like to get my entrepreneur perspective, as always, I only like monopolies that I own, and it's not a secret that we don't own it. So choice and competition is good.
So if you were Google, of course, I mean, that's pretty evident. But you really do feel very strongly that Germany could use more competition in search per se, as I understand it correctly. Is that?
Yeah, like he pointed out, I think in every market it's an advantage if there is competition, if there are alternatives. There used to be alternatives 10 years back, disappeared. So he has to analyze why they disappeared and why they couldn't sustain. But I think for all markets, competition is good for everybody.
So Dmitry, you know, we have a nice critical mass of Russians on the stage, which is unusual at a tech conference, and I'm really glad we do, because I think Americans typically don't recognize the strength of Russian technology, and Mail.ru is the other company that totally dominates its industry in Russia. So talk just a little bit about Mail.ru, because I'm sure a lot of people here don't know about your company, and do you too have aspirations to extend beyond Russia?
Yes, thank you. I can join Arkady in the idea that there is not too many countries in the world where local players are really strong. And it's Russia, it's China, and big difference between Russia and China is that China operates in closed market. If you can look on big Chinese company like Tencent, Baidu, they pretty much do not have global competition. They only compete with each other. In Russia, we have different story. So we have local competition and we have global competition, and we compete with Facebook, with global companies like Google. And this is, I think, big difference. So once we can sustain competition with global players, we can keep the market forever. If you are only living in the closed borders, once the borders will be opened, local companies can have issues. This is my view. About our company, we have like a strategy called communicament. It means that we believe in a combination of communication products like social networks, email, and instant messaging with entertainment. Its primary is games. So if you want to found like analogy globally, we are very close to a company called Tencent in China. That's what we are doing. And I think there is several interesting things happened in Russia and globally. Of course, one of the things which worried me a lot is that everybody knows what's happening in the US market. So everybody reading TechCrunch. So once you want you are popular and well known in United States, everybody knows about you. But there is a lot of cool stuff happened in other markets. And there's a lot of new business models are invented there. For example, free-to-play model, which I believe will be long-term, be bigger and bigger, and will go to the new directions and new markets. For example, guys which talked before us, like Dropbox, like Baidu, you see more and more companies are adopting free-to-play model. And I believe this will be like long-term big trend, and it will be disrupt a lot of companies. I think other important stuff is that if you talk about big picture, I think a lot of cool things happen on education stuff. So information became more and more available globally. For example, you're already sitting in China or in Russia, can see some Stanford courses or MIT courses, and this information became available for everybody. Or for example, conference. Now everybody can see what's happened in every conference in internet. And data and knowledge became more accessible. So this will be huge change. And of course, I also very personal believer in bringing game mechanics to the education. Because what I see is that a lot of interesting stuff happen in games, which can be bring to education. For example, like leveling, competition, which can bring engagement into the education. So this is stuff which is very important. And maybe last point is that you know already in internet a lot of big companies. And one of the big questions is that how to be innovative once you became big company. And this is which I think will be #1 question for a lot of companies. And there is not too many inventions. I think in startup area you can see invention called like Y incubator. It's the way how you can build startups. You also have principle like 20% time for Google. And I personally try to implement internally in our company idea of like internal incubator, where you can grow startups inside of a big company. And I believe it will be big trend, and I think it can change the way how big companies operate.
You know, it's interesting how I met Dmitry in Shenzhen, and the reason I met Dmitry in Shenzhen is that one of his biggest investors is Naspers, which is a South African company that was gathering all of its internet companies that it's invested in a global conference in Shenzhen, and it just goes to show he is part of a network that is truly global. That's why he's so close to Tencent, for example, since Naspers owns 30-some% of that. And so you have a potential sort of ecosystem to play into. So
one thing to it, it's definitely true, and one of the way how our board of the directors is designed is that we have approximately every member from each continent. So this is I believe very important to share knowledge globally, and as I said previously, there is not too many information comes from these local markets like Korea, China, Latin America. For example, I believe that we should learn a lot about e-commerce in Latin America. We should learn a lot of about gaming in Korea, and so on, so on. So this is very, very important.
I don't know where Marcel and Steffi are. Oh, there's Steffi. Next year, you should get me to interview the CEO of Naspers, because most Americans here have probably never even heard of it, and it's the best global media company that went from old media to the new media, but they have no operations in the United States, so Americans never knew it even existed. But yeah, thank you. We'll work on that together. So Greg, you had an interesting thing you were saying about headwinds versus tailwinds. Could you just give us that thinking a little bit?
Well, I think as entrepreneurs and technology specialists, there's a lot of tailwinds that we face. I mean, we can all think about the current economic crisis and what that means not only for financial markets and political systems, but and it's back to that optimism that we talked about. There's a lot of tailwinds. The fact that Moore's Law is still absolutely applying. We are making some massive investments in that Amazon Web Services infrastructure. And these are big long-term bets we're making, but we do know that the technology is going to continue to improve, and we're going to be able to use that platform to continue to innovate as technology improves. And so we think of that as a tailwind. We think of something like a tablet as a tailwind, because again, now this has unlocked the internet so that people can browse and shop or run applications or do things away from their PC in the comfort of their home. And you saw it if you looked at the ComScore data that was presented in one of the earlier sessions. You're really seeing the tablets take off after work, where the PCs have a clear spike in activities and traffic during the lunch hour, where people are using the PCs at work. So we're going to continue to see tailwinds, and a lot of that is just innovation. That's customer-focused innovation, and for me, that gets very, very exciting. Now, when you think about headwinds, certainly from a standpoint of venture capital, the supply of capital, is there good deals to be done? Is the current economic environment allow that? I think you see most progressive companies, and certainly most people in this room, very, very optimistic about where we sit right now and the things we can be driving. But there are certainly some headwinds from, at least for what the business I see in Europe, just from the regulatory environment. I come from the U.S., if you can't tell from my accent, where we've had 50 states, 50 territories, if you will, with a single market, and it certainly works that way. For our European business, we shipped from all 5 of our language websites, we shipped to all 27 countries, and we've had a very healthy business doing that. But we still constantly find certain headwinds that come in, a lot of them unintentional, but that create some territorialism. You talked about the local markets and e-commerce. I actually think a lot of that, those barriers, if we work to break those down, will create a more open environment. My favorite example is I can ship a CD to any customer in any of the 27 EU countries, but as soon as we try to deliver music digitally that way, we could come into all kinds of barriers. Again, some of them intentional, some of them unintentional, and one of the challenges we have, and I think Vivian Redian talked about that a bit yesterday, is how do we keep working to get those barriers down so that the disruption that technology is bringing is an enabler for customers instead of a frustration.
Yeah, Dmitry, get a quick comment?
Yeah, I have one question to Amazon. May I ask? Yeah, there's 2 or 3 months ago, it was news that Russia became #1 internet country in Europe, and I think it passed Germany in terms of number of internet users. So I have a question: when am Amazon come to Russia?
Well, that's also a question I get quite frequently, and we're not in a position to talk about what we may or may not do in the future. It's certainly, the internet usage is very, very high, but there's also, again, some infrastructure opportunities there and it's helpful. It's healthy to see all the investment and the growth there. But from a perspective of Amazon, I'm just not in a position to say what we might do.
I can answer for Amazon. Amazon is a business model which works on its existing infrastructure, payment and delivery. We don't have it in Russia, so it's not an Amazon market at all.
Interesting. Did you have something to say?
No, I'm looking for I want to invest in a payment company in Russia and a delivery company in Russia.
He's going to build both kinds of companies. Paul, did you?
What he is saying about the regulation is 100% right, and that is something that is in favor of nobody. Because when you are sitting, for instance, in Germany, you have to apply to different rules in Germany rather than if you would come from the US and doing business in Germany. So it gives advantages to people coming from outside doing business in Germany, as an example. So what we really need is to have the same rules in all countries, as Vivian Redding was pointing out last night. And that gives us plain level field, what we really need and what we are looking for.
Hey, Paul, I'm curious. Listening to Vivian Redding yesterday, did you applaud everything she said, or did you find there maybe a little excessive? I felt a slight tone of borderline moving towards protectionism there myself.
You know, the general message was one rule for all countries, for all 27 countries, one same layout for authorities, and same way to treat things in all countries. And that is a basic idea I applaud. I think that is what we need to have, because then we have one European market, and then we are on a level playing field with everybody else, which we are not today. So on that, a lot of applause. When she is saying it should be a global concept, I'm not sure whether that can be achieved in a foreseeable future. So what I would like to see is that we change quickly and don't have it for discussions for 10 years, discussing should we now apply the Chinese rules or the US rules or stuff like that. Let us find the right solutions for Europe. Then behind what she was saying, there's a document of about 150 pages, and if you look more into the details, there are a few things which we should discuss. The way you treat, for instance, direct marketing, there are a few issues that we should discuss. But the general statement I liked a lot.
Okay, good. You know, Niklas, one of the points you made, and by the way, in just a second I want to start hearing from audience people on anything. It can be a comment as well as a question. But one of the points you made was that as this tech industry that we are all a part of is having such a transformational effect on the world, even to the degree of, as we are talking about here a lot, politics, that it may bring new responsibilities for the industry. Talk about what you think about that.
No, you know, as we said, the size of the internet is growing at a tremendous pace, and the connectivity between people are increasing very much because of social networks and the way we communicate. And that, you know, I think if there was anything we saw last year was that was a big transformation where there's a fundamental shift of power from whoever was the one who had all power to, shifting over to the crowd on the internet. And that goes for anything from, we saw that with the Arab Spring, to some extent, with the riots in London. But we also see that with the way corporations are dealing with consumers, this is an increased transparency, so it becomes very, very hard for anyone who wants to kind of broadcast a message, whether that is through propaganda or whether that's through mass market, that whatever the product they're selling is fantastic. Today, you need to be much more honest about your message, because the internet talks back to you, and people are going to see through things and gather around that. And that, personally, I think that's fundamentally is a positive thing. But what's interesting is, as players in this industry, whether we are startup companies, whether we are investors or large established online companies, what role do we have to think about this? Because our mindset, our DNA, are always, let's go out and make great products that people want to have and that we can make money from. And we all, most of us are, I mean, the vast majority of people involved in the internet industry are doing things, you know, products which are reducing frictions, whether there's, you know, reducing frictions in communication, in public, you know, publishing or commerce and whatever, which normally is a, you know, good thing. But sometimes, you know, because this has a bigger and bigger impact on society as a whole. And, you know, I don't know, should we ask these questions to ourselves, you know, what impact do we have and what are the things we need to think about? Because we, you know, we see our regulators, our politicians coming up with proposals for regulations and trying to regulate to some extent, sometimes to create a level playing field, sometimes because they are thinking that, you know, this industry is kind of running away in a very fast speed and want to kind of somehow regulate for the sake of regulation, and sometimes because there's a lot of lobbying from adjacent industries. And, you know, I think it just raises the question, like, you know, what are the kind of the questions that we should ask ourselves? I don't have the answers, but
not that innovating any less rapidly, though, presumably.
No,
right?
I think that, you know, I wouldn't think so. I think that, you know, I don't think that, you know, whether you and I agree that we should innovate slower, which I don't think we should. That's not going to stop all the innovators out there to you know, continue to innovate. So that's something that's very, very positive.
Yeah, I mean, actually, this is why I have a conference called Techonomy. It's all about trying to have a dialogue between the tech industry and business and social sector leaders about how big their landscape is changing, and it's not an easy thing for leaders to adapt to. But I absolutely agree that tech industry needs to take a more proactive approach towards having that dialogue, and it is starting to happen, but it needs to, because the pace of change is so extraordinary. It is really hard for the average company to understand, and I mean, Nike's here. It's amazing what Nike's doing, but there aren't many companies like that. I think GE is an interesting company that's actually doing a pretty good job, but there are very, very few. Maybe Ford is another good one. There's a few, but wow, the average company is like a deer in the headlights right now.
I think the internet companies understand best what kind of regulation is a proper regulation. So they should come up with proposals early on and put them on the table to allow to discuss. If we wait until all politicians have understood what's really going on, most likely we are too late, and most likely what comes up is by far too rigid.
That's a very interesting idea, and I've never really seen that attempted, but DLD is in a very good position to try to begin that conversation. So you just, I think, proposed something to yourself there, Paul.
Yeah, and it is something, matter of fact, is happening, because if it comes to the question of data security, a proposal will be on the table soon, and I think we should do more things like that.
One thing, David, I would to come to the defense of some of the more traditional companies. The internet is very shiny right now.
You mean the ones that you're rendering irrelevant?
Yeah, no. There's you know, right now there's a lot of focus because we can see the internet. It gets a lot of press, but there's a tremendous amount. You mentioned Ford. There's a tremendous amount of innovation happening in those companies. When you think of the satellite, you know, being inside the car, that didn't exist 10 years ago, and so some of the GPS, you know, some of the supply chain productivity. If you look at the rate of productivity across a number of industries, things where data and computational power have really helped them. And certainly I see it, the reason I'm to the defense of it, a lot of those companies use Amazon Web Services and are looking to find ways to be way more productive and using data to help drive their decisions. They're just not the ones that we are all writing about or reading about necessarily in the blogs.
Yeah, but you know, to broaden Niklas's point slightly, you know, productivity is unequivocally growing in the developed world. There's no, it's obvious, in all over the world, it's clearly growing. But jobs are not growing with it. And that's a very interesting challenge, which actually I think the internet and tech industry has insight into that many other parts of society and the economy do not. And it actually raises a ton of questions about the future of the economy. It even raises questions about the future of taxation and social welfare. I mean, in the United States, we are moving into an economy where there are a large number of people who have very little prospect of jobs, and automation and technology is a very big reason for that. So it's a complicated landscape that I think the industry does well to at least address more.
Yeah, but the key to that is education. I don't buy into that technology means that we leave behind people because it must be. It is because we don't educate them properly. So if we try to foster education, I think we can solve those problems, but we have to go for it.
I hope you're right, but the data is increasingly going the other direction. But it's definitely...
Because we don't do enough.
We certainly need better education. There's no question. That's unarguable. But whether or not we can bring enough people along fast enough, given the pace of change, is pretty hard. I mean, if Foxconn is automated...
The German economy employs more people than ever.
You know that Foxconn is building itself 1 million robots to replace a large percentage of its 1 million employees. So even there, this is another matter, but it is a big picture question.
And I was just going to say, history and economics would suggest that we're in a disruption, right? So you'll think of when Gutenberg, there's a great example in the museum over here of the original Gutenberg printing press. Well, that put out a lot of people that were hand transcribing, documents, put them out of work, but it created an opportunity for them to go get trained, do something else. There was definitely a period of time when those people needed to be retrained, or maybe it took a generational shift. Industrial Revolution, certainly when automobiles put, the harness maker out of business. And so I think that's part of all of our, opportunity is to continue to evolve and find that opportunity cost where people and jobs can be redeployed to things that make a better use of what they're doing. I think it's...
Yeah, it'd be great if Amazon convened a conference of local independent bookstores to talk about that question. Anyway,
and bookstores. This is one where there will be lots of winners, over time in e-commerce, and there will certainly the physical bookstore is an area where people will reinvent themselves, and you'll see a number that specialize and find ways to be, do something that Amazon can't. So it definitely comes with, the disruption comes with the need for people to innovate and redesign what they're doing.
But as Paul says, education, really it brings some very major social policy issues to the fore that, frankly, I think in most Western democracies are not being discussed enough. That's all the point I'm making.
A, and B, we don't invest enough money on that. And through nets, through the internet, it should be cheaper. So we should really foster initiatives that bring more education. By education, I don't mean only the upper end of what is possible for highest possible talent. I mean for ordinary people to do things and find better jobs. And as I said while you were speaking, in Germany, we never employed more people in our society than today. Never. So it's possible.
Good. I got to say, DLD is a great effort in this general area. I mean, I think it's amazing how successfully you bring together a very broad community to discuss some of these issues. So, I mean, and a company that no one would have expected to do it, which actually brings me to a question I wanted to ask you, a softball, about transforming Berta, because you told me a statistic yesterday that was quite impressive about how Berta itself is changing in this landscape.
Yeah, I think every company in every industry has to change, so do we. I don't know whether it's much different from other industries and it's much different from other countries. We managed to grow, and we want to further grow in a stable environment. So we did last year a bit more than 20%. And we try to be on a route that is growing 10% and more every year, and I think it's doable.
But that's not the statistic I meant. Maybe you don't want to give the figure, but the percentage of your revenue that's digital is extraordinarily high, I mean, for a company of your type.
Yeah, on the other hand, it's too low. It's in the range of 40% right now and should go up, but that's not a paradigm. We want to grow all our business, and digital is a more important part in every segment of the business that we are in.
Yeah, that's good.
I just touch on that. I think what's interesting now, to me, it feels like in some of the countries which are more developed in terms of e-commerce, is that feels like we're around an inflection point where the digital economy is so strong. E-commerce is maybe around 10% in some of the Northern European countries. And also because of some of the innovations like the smartphones, you see consumers go into a shop and they try out some shoes or some clothes, and they just go on their smartphone and order it online on, I don't know, on Amazon or some other place. So maybe the last 10 years, was a slow growth in the digital economy, which didn't really have a big impact on, the traditional, whether you're media or commerce, because it was still a small percentage. But I think in the next 5 years, it's going to have you may see some kind of a hockey stick effect where, retailers really have to rethink their business models, and there's going to be a massive shift because they have so high cost in having a lot of staff. They have all the shops all around, which implies a lot of cost. So I think that we're going to see a lot of there's going to be a lot of innovation within the existing companies, or there's going to be a lot of companies that's going to, if they don't understand that they need to really transform themselves like Berta is doing, they will go under.
So who has comments or questions from the audience? Esther, always a good source of questions. Can we get a mic for Esther? Okay, shout it loud.
The question is, okay, this is a big picture question. I'll rely on you to make these guys get more specific. Talk about your planning cycle. When you're a VC, you can afford to wait 2, 3, 4 years for profits, though some VCs like it faster. When you're a family company, you can be very long-term. You can be like Amazon. You can be a public company, and you worry about your stock price. How does that fit into this faster, quarterly, stock price-oriented world, and how do you fight back?
Go ahead, but I'd like to hear Paul on that one, too. Niklas,
Okay.
well, Niklas is going to start.
I can give a comment on that. That because of a lot of public companies, have been coming into this quarter by quarter reporting, and it's become very reactive to the stock markets. I think that's one of the reasons why you see a lot of the tech companies tending to stay private for a much longer period of time. I think a great example, is like when Amazon went public in '95 at around something like $400 million valuation, and today they're like whatever 90 billion. So half percentage of that valuation was in the private market. When Google went public 2002, about 14% to the private market at 23 billion IPO. This year we may see $100 billion IPO from Facebook, but then almost maybe half of that value is going to be in the private market, and companies want to stay private longer time so they can think about the long-term planning and how to build companies for that long-term vision.
Yeah, and very specifically, the reason Mark Zuckerberg has not wanted to go public is because he was afraid that it would slow down his ability to be responsive to the market, which I frankly think he's very justified in worrying about.
I agree.
For me, it's not long-term, short-term. For me, the question is what is fundamentally right. If we are convinced that something is fundamentally right, we stick to it as long as necessary. If we think it's not fundamentally right, we get out quicker than anybody else. For us to take decisions, it normally takes a day or so. The owner is extremely close to the business. We can take decisions every day, and we do, even fundamental decisions. So are we fundamentally convinced? We back. If you are fundamentally convinced it's wrong, we are quicker out than anybody else without looking into any quarterly earnings report or stuff like that.
Arkady, the question is, Arkady, sorry, is how your planning cycles and thinking have to adapt to a much faster-paced world. How do you feel about it?
We didn't change much in our planning. When we went public and become globally known, of course it's influenced the scale of our thinking. And it takes you to be a Russian company, like we are here, two of us, to become public. Otherwise, who would ever invite a Russian company to this panel? But now we are the two biggest European internet companies, which is a shame for Europe, I think.
What is your turnover?
I don't remember the numbers, exact numbers, but it's more than $600 million last year,
So
and
it's
growing.
Good than half of ours. Very good.
But your market cap
Next
is
year
around,
it will be almost the same.
Yandex's market cap is around $6 billion.
Yeah. The same as for
Any other comments on this speed
We
question?
are not quoted.
I think if you can look on the internet companies, I think there is some of them who became lucky that their business model can work like 10, 20 years, and they don't need to change much. So like you just invent something and you stay in the same direction for a very long period. For our company, you can see that we have some different changes. So we start from email, then we're going to instant messaging, then we go to social networks. So we always have some disruption in our core products. And I think one of the important stuff for us is that continue to innovate. And one of the ways, as I said, is try to create like internal startup culture. So we can try to find new ideas and come there. So this is very important because usually I know a lot of companies who are like doing one thing very long period of time, And once their business model start to change, they are in big trouble. And this is very important, I think.
I think one thing to Esther's question, that at least for Amazon, it very much comes down to getting everybody bought in on the vision. And as a public company, obviously you're under much more scrutiny, so you really have to have a board of directors that are on board and willing to take some criticism. And we really say we want to be long on vision. We'll change our minds very quickly on execution issues and how to do better, but we will stay in for the long run and be willing to be misunderstood. If the stock price is disrupted, or there's a lot of press that's being critical, you have to, get your employee base staying heads down focused on continuing to drive the right things for customers, and just take an article of faith. If you're serving customers correctly, that'll sort itself out in the end. That also happens, by the way, when things are very shiny, when the company is gleaming and you're getting lots of rave reviews. You have to remind your employee base, hey, let's stay focused on the customers, not what people externally are talking about us, because we want to stay focused on the long-term vision, because we will see ups and downs. That's a very difficult discipline to install in a public company.
Yeah, and by the way, we're not going to have all 5 of them answer every question, but I want to hear some more questions. I want to get a few things out on the table. So who else has it? Over here? Do you have a mic? Can we get the mic real fast?
Hello. I wanted to ask the Russian companies, how do you combine the global thinking with the Russian reality, corruption and all the governmental privacy infringements, everything else?
We don't have any big issues on our markets. We dominate our respective markets and we just protect them. What we're thinking of globally is that we have technologies which are powerful enough and unique enough in the world to go somewhere else. And I think it's a bad perception of our life.
Are you saying that you don't spend a lot of time thinking about corruption in Russian political and economic culture and doing your own business?
No, we are in virtual business, and there is different Russians. We don't sell oil or gas, and we're a completely different set of companies. Started from scratch, never privatized anything. We just grow our businesses. Yes, we're large enough. We have the issues. Being a large internet entity, you need to be responsible and so on, but it's nothing more than you have on any other market.
Yeah, I just want to add, I agree with Arkady. I say that we have 2 revenue streams from LTRU. One is the advertising, and other one is where users pay money, so like fee-based services. So it's pretty much like virtual stuff, not related with like oil, gas, other things. I think we have, of course, Russia have a lot of specifics, but globally I think we have one big issue that governments still do not know how exactly to operate with internet, because it's changing, and it's not only a question for Russia. You can look at what's happened with the United States, like SOPA stuff or anything else. I think this is one issue. Second issue is that internet do not have borders. And once you have, for example, users who are sitting in Russia, one law, users who access the same site outside of Russia can have different law. And if service hosting in third country, it can be like third law. And this is a big question, how our government can work with internet. And I think it's not only a question for Russia. Of course, we have a lot of Russian issues, but I think it's a global issue. Yeah. And a lot of discussions globally and everywhere. And I think in Davos, it will be like also one of the major topics, how government can regulate but still keep freedom on the internet. So this is, I think, a major question.
It is amazing if you think about those of us who were here at DLD last year. It was really entirely before Arab Spring. All that has happened in 1 year since the last DLD. And there's nothing that concerns Vladimir Putin or the leadership of China more than that. I can assure you, even if our Russian friends don't want to talk about it, and I don't blame them. But it's certainly a major shift that this industry is creating. And the countries that have there's so many countries that are undemocratic. And but then this fascinating question that comes up over and over again, which is a big picture question, is, well, internet can bring things down, can it build them up? And we don't know the answer as alternatives. Anybody? I know this is something you think about a lot, Niklas.
Yeah, well, I think when you're talking about building things up, I think one of the things that we can talk about is building this ecosystem of how the internet ecosystem and the entrepreneurial ecosystem where if you look at DLD is a good example, which is great conference here in Europe, getting better and better for every year. More and more people coming here, becomes more and more of a important venue. But I think it also represents very much that the ecosystem for technology companies, for entrepreneurs in Europe is growing at a very, very good pace. And I think that's something that's very, very positive. It's one of the ways to also to get out of the economical crisis, because there's very, very little debt related to the internet economy. It's about innovation, about making things more efficient. And I think that the more and more we can all help to build that ecosystem, the better we will also do for the rest of the economy.
That's interesting. Okay, who's got another comment or question? Okay, here, can we get a mic right here? Okay, it's coming over from over there. There you go.
Thank you. Krishan Bhatia with NBC Universal Comcast. This is certainly a question that we ask ourselves all the time in the media business, which is how does internet technology and internet technology companies, how are they transforming the economics, not of that individual business, but of the industry at large? And maybe it's for Greg in part this question, but I think when Amazon started, there's obviously a ton of value creation in Amazon as a company. When you look at your profit margins and the promise of the internet back in the 90s, that it would eliminate bricks and mortar types of costs by being digitally focused, how has it affected the net economics of the retail business from your lens vis-a-vis the entire business? I think I just Googled it. Your EBIT margin is somewhere around 3 to 4%. I don't know what it was for retail in the past, but how do you look at value creation from an industry perspective versus just an individual company?
I would say it's less about the individual company, but actually the entire consumer market. So if you think of customers, we've been very focused about saying any of the benefits that we're gaining by scale, we're going to hand back to customers in the form of lower prices, and that and what that has allowed us to do is grow the pie. You're seeing a lot more volume at these lower price points. As more and more customers are consuming music, videos, books, and in different forms. So we've got long form, short form, continue to expand, and that's one of the benefits as we see with digital. Digital will take some cost out of the value chain, and at least for us, I think of, we've got the content creator or the innovator, if it's an application, for example, and you've got a customer over the other end of the value stream, and everything between had better be adding value and is an opportunity for disruption or to continue to create value for either ends of those continuum. And that's where we spend our time around. But again, we've made a long-term commitment to try to take some of the profits that we would get with those cost savings and give them back to customers in the form of lower prices.
Well, it's a very complex big picture, but it's encouraging that so many, all of our panelists are so convinced that it's a very optimistic one. So thank you all for spending the time having this discussion. And thank you all.